Now here's the part where I ask, how much did you pay for it?
How much is it worth?
Hi, I'm George the Antique Nomad. Come with me as I wander the country in search of valuable vintage, amazing antiques, and cool collectibles. We'll buy, sell, and trade at antique malls, shops, and shows, estate sales, flea markets, thrift stores, anywhere people go to find really interesting things that just aren't made anymore. So come on, let's go!
Well, everyone is assembling for the appraisal fair, and it looks like we have a fairly nice turnout, and a lot of people seem to have brought things, so I am curious to see what they've got. It's always fun because this is just blind, and we come in not knowing what they're going to bring, and then we figure it out from there.
I so much enjoy doing this. I'm so glad you had me back. It's been a couple of long, lonely years, so it's great to be back again. I took a moment to go into your gift shop and pull out a couple of things that I thought were interesting for various reasons, and maybe to encourage you to price them a little higher, because I think that you have some real bargains here. This one didn't have a price. It just seems like a simple little vase that would be used to put a few flowers here and a few flowers there. But this funny vase with the crackling and the joinery at the top is by a company called Blenko Glass from West Virginia. And Blenko was the subject of a PBS special about 10 or 15 years ago. They are still in business. Their stuff is very popular with the modernists nowadays. Glass is hand blown. It's got the pontil mark, which is very rough. So they have it on a blowpipe. And to make it crackle, what they do is they've got it out on the blowpipe. It's 1500 degrees. They've got a vat of cold water next to them, and they take the whole thing and they dunk it in and take it out really fast. And the cold water makes it all crack, but it's so hot it fuses itself right back together again, so it doesn't fall apart. But that's where the crackle comes from. And there are some people who really love crackle glass. So this little piece, retail on this is probably $20. And I'm just telling you that so if you price it for the flea market, you might put 8 or 10 on it rather than 2 or 3. This particular piece I just had to show because I wrote a book on a company called Treasurecraft Pottery out of California. And this was one of the last things that they made in the late 1980s, and it was a line called Taos. They never made dinnerware before the 1980s, but back in the 80s, people still wanted made in America, and the stores wanted made in America. And a lot of the big California dinnerware makers, for various reasons, either one of them was bought out by the English and they took everything overseas, so it wasn't American made anymore. Another big one, the couple who owned it got a divorce, and the divorce was really ugly, and the company was shut down and all the assets were sold. All of a sudden, they didn't have American dinnerware makers, so they asked Treasurecraft, who had made cookie jars and Disney figures and stuff like that, could you please make dinnerware for us? So they started making this, and it was actually kind of a feat because they managed to make a mold that made it look like it was hand thrown, even though it's not. And then they would hand paint all of this detail on it. They would have all these decorators who, like most pottery companies, were women working in an assembly line, and they would paint little chilies and little triangles and do the rim, and it all was done by hand, and it was made in America. And so they did very well with this for a while, especially because Santa Fe style was big decorating in the late 80s. So this piece here, which I don't think you had priced, eBay prices on this are about $35 to $40 now, believe it or not, because what happened was in the 90s, Treasurecraft got bought by Pfalzgraff, and Pfalzgraff said, we're going to make everything in America forever, and 5 years later, the minute that China got most favored trading status, they shipped everything over to China and quit making it in the USA, and all the department stores said, we don't want it. And so that was it. And because of that, a lot of people who collect this weren't able to finish their collections. That's why this stuff actually sells. Now this one, which might look super modern, is actually not as modern as it looks. And funnily enough, it is by the same company that made this teapot. It was made by the Hall China Company, but this is a line they called Hallcraft, and it was designed by a woman named Eva Zeisel. Eva Zeisel was an emigre from Germany. I believe she escaped when Hitler came to power. She was a ceramics designer. She ended up doing this particular line for Hall China and some other things. They were extremely modern and ahead of their time. This came out in the late 50s, I believe. You see it with various patterns. This one happens to be, I think they called this one bouquet, but the shape is called classic. And her stuff goes for good money. The modernists just love her. And she died about 5 years ago at the age of 100. And she was still cantankerous as ever and still designing china right up until her death. And so this, you've got $5 on. It's probably a $30 piece. I would say, you know, bump it up, maybe put 15 on it. Somebody's going to come and recognize that. And then the last things I pulled, and I pulled these because someone here knows a story about them, and if you could identify yourself and tell us that story.
My dad worked at Hall China for 49 years, and in his later years, he made all the samples for the airlines, the liquor stores, and so forth. And my dad actually poured the molds for that and Eva Zeisel.
That is so cool. That's such a great story. One of the things I love about being in Florida is so many people have retired here who have a history that connects to American manufacturing that doesn't exist anymore. Now, fortunately, Hall China does still exist. They're part of Homer Laughlin, and they still do restaurant wear. But it's so interesting to me that he did samples for these various companies. You can tell it's a sample because it doesn't even have a Hall China mark on it. This was just something that they made to send out to the people who made Old Taylor whiskey and say, hey, you know how they'll do, like, I think it was the late 60s, early 70s, they started doing premiums, like here's a bottle of our hooch and here's something you can serve it in, and they'd sell it together as a box set around Christmas time. Well, this would have been a sample for them to say, how about if we make it look like this? Samples are kind of hard to find. Now, this is something that, because it doesn't say Hall China, most people would overlook and miss. But because you know the story and where it came from, we know the story too. And I just really wanted to share that because I just think that's so great. And what a neat thing that he was able to be involved with all of this stuff. And to be a sample maker meant you were pretty far up in the company and the production, because you know, they wanted it to be as good as possible because they're trying to use this to sell this company on ordering a bunch of these. So he had to be pretty proficient. And I just like the fact that it's got this great story. You know, you have very inexpensive prices on these, and I realize why, because to somebody coming in here, they're not going to know what this is. They're not going to know why it's significant. I don't know if there's anyone here who sells on eBay, but if you have anyone here who's capable of that or somebody associated with you, you might, I know you're trying to raise funds for the garden club, you might actually tell your story and have them put it on the computer and just see if somebody who's a Hall China collector says, wow, that's really interesting. You never see those. That's a really rare thing. I would like to have it, because you know, you've only got like $3 and $4 on them, and I would think that they might be $30 or $40 if you could find that person interested in that background.
Close the boutique to reprice all those items.
Okay, so the next piece I'm picking up is this one, and I was asked whether it should be evaluated by its owner, and I said yes, it absolutely should. It is a Victorian piece, so it really does have a lot of age. You see a very deep pontil mark on here, a deep dimple, and that's one way of telling Victorian glass. Reproductions from China, they use a machine that polishes the whole thing off flat, so you won't see that dimple anymore. Another thing about it is it's got enameling on it, and what enamel is it's where you take glass and paint and you mix it together in a solution so that when you paint on with the enamel, it's got just enough glass in it that when you fire it, it fuses to the surface, and that's why it doesn't just wear right off. Now, it will wear off if you scrub at it or chip at it, or you shouldn't use ammonia cleansers on these old pieces like this or anything like that. But this is Victorian. It is a coin spot pattern. You can see these little dots in here. They refer to that as coin spot. It's a very pretty color of blue, and this is likely to date sometime in the 1880s, roughly. It could be as early as the 1870s, as late as the 1890s. It likely was made in the United States. There are certain companies where we know their wares very well, but there's a whole lot of this sort of thing where we really don't know who made things. The factories burned down regularly back then. All the paperwork, all the catalogs would be lost, and that was the end of it. So we don't know who the maker is, but it's likely to be American. It's nice that it's a pitcher, and it actually was made to be functional. It would never have had a top. It's a ewer, but it actually was something you could pour onto your plants or into a glass or something like that. And it's a really pretty color. I've always been partial to these. Now here's the part where I ask, how much did you pay for it?
How much is it worth? Honestly, I found that in the summer in Tennessee again, and I think I gave $15 or $20.
$15 or $20. Well, you did very well.
I left the store and went back a half an hour later and debated on it.
And debated on it. Well, I'm glad it was still there for you because, you know, I'll tell you, it sounds like a sales job, but it's happened to me too. I always tell people, you know, buy it when you see it if you like it because we can't order another one. And I had the same thing happen at the last show. I saw something in my neighbor's booth I liked. I said, oh, I'll come back. And it was almost like the moment you touch it, it gets the scent. And 5 minutes later, I watched some woman walk by with it. And I thought, oh, I always tell people this. I should listen to my own advice. I would say this is probably worth between $65 and $85. Okay, somebody brought a very handsome looking book here, and that was you. And what can you tell me about this? How'd you get it?
I'm not sure. I think I got it at a thrift store.
Okay,
Probably about 30 years ago.
very good.
And it said it was written by Teddy Roosevelt. It does not have the ending because he died.
Right, exactly. And that is an interesting thing. And they talk about that in the foreword. I've seen this book before. It's called Theodore Roosevelt, an Autobiography. And in the introduction, they talk about that they have chosen not to add to the book, that they will do a follow-up. This was done by Scribner's and Sons. This was originally published in 1913, I believe. Yes, that's right. Originally by Scribner's in 1913 when Teddy Roosevelt was still alive. Then when he passed on in 1919, they started reissuing it because there was a lot of interest in him. And they say right here, in issuing this new edition, it has not been considered right to supplement it by any additional chapters written by another hand. And then they talk about, we're going to put out a book where other people talk about him. So this is just what he had done through life and letters through about 1913. So it doesn't talk about his going off to Africa and being a big game explorer and going to South America and all the other things he did, but it does talk a lot about everything that happened through about the time where he started the Bull Moose Party, split off from the Republican Party, and they lost the election, et cetera, et cetera. It is a surprisingly valuable book. They kept reissuing it every couple of years, and I honestly thought, well, you know, because there were a lot of reissues, maybe this really won't have a lot of value. But it turns out that it does. In this condition, this book is selling somewhere in the $75 to $85 range. So for a thrift store find, I imagine you did rather well.
Yeah.
And it's a very interesting book. He was a very interesting man. I am very, very distantly related to him through one branch of the family. Family relative in the Merchant Marines brought this back, presumably. Oh, very nice. And if you look at it closely, there's some nice aspects to it. First of all, it's got this nice inlay around the edges here. And secondly, you'll see the palm trees, and at the bottom it says Rio de Janeiro. A lot of these were made in Brazil, and this sort of iridescent blue you see back here, these are butterfly wings. And there are a lot of collectors who like things made with butterfly wings. It's something they don't really do anymore because the blue butterflies and the iridescent butterflies are a little more protected now. This was a craft. You saw jewelry made of it. It was especially popular in Florida in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. It was a thing that sold very well to tourists here, and the butterfly wing jewelry has a big audience as well. but people really do like these. The fact that Rio is written in small letters and is not the feature is actually a good thing for these. When it says Brazil in big letters and stuff, it's not as desirable to the collectors because most of the collectors really want to see the scene, and that's what it's about. So the fact that this one has the ship and the 2 palm trees and the landscape makes this a pretty good one. And there is a good collector market for these now. I saw one sell in West Palm Beach again at the big antique show there for $75 when I was there a couple of weeks ago. And I would say that that was a fair price these days. What can you tell me about them and how you got them?
I really know nothing about them except that if they are old, they're gaudy Welsh.
Yes.
And the pink around the brim is called moonglow luster.
That's right. That's right. Moonglow luster or copper luster. And you are absolutely right. These are old and they are in fact gaudy Welsh. There were 2 types of ceramics made in Staffordshire in the early 1800s. One was called gaudy Dutch, one was called gaudy Welsh. The difference primarily has to do with, first of all, gaudy Dutch was old enough that it didn't have maker's marks at all. This one does have a mark here, which I believe is probably the Riley Company of Staffordshire area of England. The other difference is that the gaudy Welsh has this luster around the edge. And so the information you had is absolutely right. And yes, these are older pieces. The English figured out how to do the copper luster, this metallic glaze, around the 1840s, and it was very popular. You have to think back to Victorian times. Houses were very dark inside. You might have kerosene lamps, you might have gas lighting, there was no electricity. And so people often say, oh, the Victorians, they were so lavish and they over-decorated and they had so much stuff and all of that fancy glass with all that cut work. Well, that was because you needed light to be reflected around the room as much as possible. And so this was another thing that was reflective, so it was popular. The patterns on it are reminiscent of European porcelain, which is why they referred to the Dutch in the case of gaudy Dutch. But it's European porcelain that was based in turn on, it's an interesting combination where you have both elements of European folk painted ceramics and things coming over from Asia, because until the late 1700s, they could not make porcelain in Europe. Only the Chinese had the secret for that. And so the Chinese would export porcelain to the houses of Europe. If you were wealthy, you would order a set from China. It might take 6 months or a year for them to make it and ship it to you. And so when they finally were able to use ironstone, this is not porcelain, this is actually it's an intermediate. It's not fired quite as high as a porcelain, but it's not as low fired as earthenware. When they were able to do this, then they started decorating it in those ways that were familiar to them. So that's what you have, and they are indeed what you thought they were. The values on these are pretty good. I would estimate somewhere in the range of probably $100 to $120 on the smaller and maybe $120 to $150 on the larger bowl, which is also a little more desirable because of the design inside. Okay, now the next piece I'm going to show, I was asked to show and I want to show because this one is a fake. This is Roseville's jonquil pattern, but this is not the way that Roseville made it. And I wanted to show you this because it has on the bottom in script Roseville, which is the right mark. Roseville, a very famous pottery company out of Ohio, but it does not say USA. And the reason for that is that when the Chinese started reproducing Roseville about 30 years ago, they were marking it Roseville, USA. And thankfully, enough collectors, Roseville was a very popular collectible at that time, enough collectors got together and petitioned Congress to actually enforce our laws and make them not put made in USA on things that were not made in the USA. So because of that, we know that this one is not really Roseville. This one is better than most of the Chinese ones, but it's a little blotchy. There's a blotch of green and then a blotch of brown. The original Roseville was very carefully done. It's like airbrush. The colors blend into each other. And the other thing is that the clay on the bottom, it's sort of a light beige color. Roseville had tan clay, and it would be darker than this. And the reason I'm showing you all this is because Roseville's something that a lot of people have in their houses that has been passed down by their forebears, or they liked it and they bought a piece, or they collected a little bit. It's one of the more collectible pottery companies. And I just want people to know what they're looking at, because it is something that is intended to deceive. And we do not like that in the antique business. So this is a good example of what you're looking to avoid as far as Roseville pottery goes. Thank you for supplying that. The person who brought that was aware of all of that and told me, I just thought you might want to show this, and I thought that was a great idea. Now, somebody brought these two little items here, and who is the owner of these? Ah, okay, and what can you tell me about them?
I found them in my father's thing, and he was a barber.
You found them in your dad's stuff, and he was a barber, and they're little oilers. And you would think, well, that makes sense because he might have been oiling like a pair of hair clippers or that sort of thing. And perhaps he used them for that. You will often see them where they say Singer Company because they were used for oil for sewing machines. But in your case, both of yours say Shakespeare. And the reason they say Shakespeare is that Shakespeare was a maker of fishing equipment. These were made to oil fishing reels and that sort of thing. So that's what these particular oilers were used for. Little oilers are something that really nobody paid attention to until probably 10 or 15 years ago, and now they are really collectible. I think because they're a practical item, they last forever, they're neat looking, they're small, you can put a lot on one shelf. Also because what we found since the advent of Pawn Stars and American Pickers and some of these other television shows, men have finally started to be included in the collecting realm. When I first got in the business 30 years ago, we had a lot of really excited women dragging their very bored husbands through antique malls. And we thought that was a real problem. So we started looking for things and dealers who had things that we thought would appeal to men a little bit. We had a tool dealer, we had someone who had advertising, we had someone who did toy cars. And we saw that men were interested in collecting, they just wanted to look at the stuff that was familiar and interesting to them. Fishing equipment is definitely among that. So these, if they were Singer, which are really common, they might be $3 to $5 a piece, but because they are fishing related, probably more $10 to $12 a piece. Which, you know, for some little thing that you might just find in a drawer is not bad. Okay, we have this guy who is some sort of an Arab sheik, and who is the owner? Ah, okay, and what can you tell us about this?
Lived on my mother-in-law's wall removal home in Florida, and when she passed away, I acquired it, so he's lived in my closet for about 30 years.
Ah, very good. Well, he might like to come out of the closet. He is a Bossons. He has a mark on the back that says Bossons, Congleton, England. Bossons is no longer in business. They were in business until the mid-90s. But Bossons was known for making chalkware figures. They did a lot of heads. They did some full figures, but mainly the heads that hung on the wall. And they represented all sorts of people from all over the world, various occupations. There's the old salt who's a sailor. They're chalkware, but they were very well molded. Most chalkware up until Bossons started doing this was rather cheaply and crudely done. It was stuff you made carnival prizes out of, and nobody really thought much about it. And they thought, well, it's such an easy medium to mold. If we hand painted over it, we could make some really nice things. Now, the only problem with chalkware is it does tend to chip a little bit. You have a few little nicks on him. They could be touched up. It would certainly, if you can match the color, it would be better looking. You know, once they're chipped, the value is what it is, so it wouldn't really matter. You're not trying to fool anyone with it. This company also made a line of plaques called Ivorex that usually show English cathedrals and other scenes, and that was related. They came from the same factory. They were really popular to collect probably 25 or 30 years ago. They've gone down in value a little bit because the company went out of business, and I think the company being in business and putting out new lines was keeping the collector market growing. So Nowadays, this one's probably a $25 item, I would say. I saw somebody, and they gave me a very large sheet of what they have in their service. Said they have service for 8 with dinner plates, cups and saucers, dessert plates, sauce dishes, soup tureen, and cream and sugar bowl. And who is the owner of this set? Okay, and tell me how you got it.
This came, my mom passed them down to me because she didn't want them any longer. Were passed down to her from a family relative who didn't want them any longer. They're taking up too much space in my kitchen, so I'm willing to put somebody else enjoy them.
Yes, okay. Well, that is actually the good and bad of China these days. She said that it came down through several generations and now it's her turn and she'd like to let it go. And unfortunately, a whole lot of people feel that way about fancy sets of China these days. However, I can tell you a little about this. It has a mark on the bottom, Johann Haviland from Bavaria. They chose the name Haviland because it sounds like Limoges, which is French. And this is styled a lot like Limoges because it's got lots of detail and scroll work in the blank. The blank would be if it had no decoration. And then the floral garland is very small and fine like French Limoges porcelain often was. But this particular set was made in Bavaria, and these were very popular in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. In fact, they were so popular that at one point you could actually buy pieces of this at the grocery store. If you spent a certain amount of money, you could spend a couple extra dollars and get a piece to take home with you. So a lot of people in the United States actually have this pattern. And some people are still trying to add to it because they didn't get all the pieces. Particularly, your soup tureen is going to be the most valuable of the pieces you have in the set, and would probably sell individually for $35 to $50, maybe even more. Now, the difficulty, of course, is that two things. One is that a lot of people, it was very much the tradition, and I'm sure a lot of you remember this growing up, that you had the good set of china that you only used on special occasions. And then you had the stuff you used every day. And you might even have another good set of china for really special occasions. Well, most people don't live very formally anymore, so most people just want one set of everyday dishes, and selling fancy china has become hard because of it. The other difficulty is it has silver border. Silver and gold borders cost money back in the day. It was a premium to have a silver and gold border. That's because people didn't have microwaves yet. As soon as people got microwaves, they realized you can't put anything with silver or gold paint in the microwave because it will spark and catch fire. And so all of a sudden, all of this wonderful fancy stuff suddenly was not very practical. And that's the big problem with it. Now, the time to sell this is when you're getting close to June brides. That's when you're going to see that and Thanksgiving and Easter, right before people who do still entertain or have families come over, have a big gathering. That's when this sort of thing is going to sell for you. Value on the set, the service for 8 is probably, if you were going to sell it on eBay, which is a hassle because you've got to ship a whole box of china, you might get $250 to $300 for the set. Tell me how you got this.
Oh, it came from my mother, and I think she said it was my grandfather's. And there's glasses, or stem glasses.
Stem glasses that go with. So it was a little dessert set or a little wine and cheese or that sort of thing. It is depression glass. This is actually elegant depression glass. It's a little better made than the stuff you would have gotten in the box of oats back then. It is etched, and the etch on it is a floral etch. This is what we refer to as a jeweler's etch, and what that means is that this etched pattern was not made by the big glass company that made the blank, the piece without the etch. It was probably made by, I'm guessing from the shade of pink, I'm thinking this might have been made by Cambridge Glass out of Ohio. But in any event, the etch on it, which is your pattern, was done by a local jeweler. And the reason that they would do that is because then, say for example, you had someone signing up for a wedding registry. If they signed up for this pattern, well then everyone had to go to the same local jeweler and buy from them because they were the only ones doing this etch. And that makes them a little bit hard to match. So if you are missing pieces from something that is not a factory etch and was done by a local jeweler, your best chance is to go to the town that that jeweler was in to try to find a match for it. And you know, the value, your etched stems are probably worth about $8 to $10 each, and the little plate's about $5 a piece.
Well, I found it after my mother passed away, cleaning out her house. It was tucked away in a cabinet, and I had never seen it before. She never displayed it, so I don't know anything more about it.
Well, it is Japanese, believe it or not. And the reason we know that is because of this enamel beading. I mentioned with this piece here, the blue pitcher, that enamel is paint in a glass suspension. And the Japanese like to use it as beading, so they would go and somebody by hand, this is all hand painted, someone had to dot every single little dot, and then when they were all done, then they would fire it in the kiln so it would stick to the base. Then they would come back and paint the roses, and the very last thing they would paint is all this gold. And then the gold is not fired, so the gold is just painted on. So that's why, again, don't use Windex, don't scrub, because this can come off fairly easily. This would have originally been a little biscuit jar with a lid. Biscuits are the little tea biscuits that the English like to have with their tea. So this originally would have been meant for export, more likely to England than the United States, but a lot of them came here too because people like little jars for any number of reasons. You could see using this in a boudoir for cotton balls, for example. I mean, there's lots of reasons people would have a piece like this. It has no mark with the country of origin. In 1891, we decided that we wanted to stop other countries from dumping their excess production on us and putting our factories out of business, so we passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, and part of that said, you have to put the country of origin on the items that you made. But we mainly were talking to England when we said that at first. So for about 20 more years, England had to put Made in England on their stuff, but we didn't really enforce it very much with anyone else. Well, as World War I came along, then we started saying we need to know where everything came from, and that's when we started making them put Nippon on Japanese items. This doesn't say Nippon, so I believe this piece dates between about 1900 and 1915. With a lid, it would be worth about $65. Without a lid, unfortunately, probably fairly low value. Do you mind me asking how much you paid at a yard sale?
I paid $8.
$8. Well, you did pretty well. This is silver plate. It's not marked sterling. It does have a mark on the bottom, though, and it actually refers to it is called What'll You Have? And it is by the Edwin Burke's Sons, I believe, is the maker, and it's got a design patent on it. In the late 20s and early 30s, we were still in Prohibition. And these would have been made initially to serve hot beverages like coffee and such. Well, then Prohibition was lifted in 1933. It was the middle of the Depression, and all of the companies were desperate to have a new product to make. So what they did is they did something that then was copied by many other companies for years to come, and they put a wreath of grapes around the top, and then all sorts of cocktail recipes on the side. So it tells you how to make a Bronx, it tells you how to make a Canadian, a Dubonnet, a Coronation. Over here we have a maple leaf, and it says 1/2 whiskey or gin, 1/4 orange juice, and 1/4 maple syrup. Well, that sounds pretty good. It's an interesting piece, and the people who like this are people who collect vintage barware. So this is from sometime about 1935. And, you know, for your $8 investment, I'd say that you probably have a $30 or $35 piece here. Now, it is silver plate. It's pretty worn. If you don't like the patina, you could polish it, and it would probably shine up some. Personally, patina doesn't bother me, and these things, if you polish silver, you can use silver all the time and it won't tarnish if you use it all the time. If you leave it out in the air and you don't touch it, it turns black. So a lot of people avoid silver and silver plate now because they think it's hard to take care of. I have a set of silver flatware I use every day because I use it every day. It doesn't tarnish and I never have to polish. This one is also a Waltham, but back in the old days, you didn't necessarily buy a watch and it came in a case. You'd go to a jeweler and you'd say, I want that movement, and then I want that case over there. In this particular case, even though this is an American watch, they chose a Swiss or European case, and it is marked 585 inside. 585 is how Europeans mark 18 karat gold. So this is actually a higher carat weight of gold than the American case that you have. So it is going to be the most valuable of the watches. So as far as your values go, the two that are gold filled that don't work are probably going to value about $30 to $35, and they would be something you could have restored or just have as parts. The sterling and coin silver cases, because of the cases, are going to be worth somewhere in the $50 to $75 range, even though they're not in working order. The gold watches, you're probably looking at somewhere in the $300 to $400 each range on those because of the gold cases. The pocket watch market has really declined lately, although the very valuable ones still are. But the reason for that is that it was very collectible with the generation of people who remembered their fathers and grandfathers carrying them. Well, now almost no one carries a pocket watch, but wristwatches from the 1940s and 50s are suddenly shooting through the roof, and some of them are very valuable. So it's just one of those time carries on things, but you have a couple that are really good because of what they were made. I hope this was interesting and maybe educational and maybe helpful in some way. If there's anything that I can do for any of you, I have cards here. You're welcome to take them. And are there any questions?
What's your YouTube channel again?
It's called the Antique Nomad. And what I do is I show antique shows that I go to and things like this so that I can explain to people, you know, I just like to share, like, your father worked for the place, so you know the story behind this. We're getting into a generation where nobody's parents make anything. I mean, there's so little manufactured here now that the connection to the fact that this came from somewhere and somebody spent their life doing this thing, those are the stories I want to preserve. So that's why I'm doing it, and it's really fun to see the response. I'm doing antique shows in Florida and having 8 and 10 and 12 people coming and saying, oh, I saw you on the computer and now I'm at an antique show for the first time. And it's just really neat to see people getting interested because, you know, this is our history, and I'm just glad to try to help preserve some of that.
It was like the 1960s, but did you say it was from China or Japan?
It's Japan. It's got the Lefton mark here. George Lefton was an American who started importing things from Japan right after the war, and this was their initial mark right after the occupation ended, and then they started doing these stickers.
And I noticed all the cups I have that number on it.
Yes, and that's a stock. That probably has to do with this shape and the fact that it was painted with this detail. And so that's the reason for the number. It's a stock number.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for joining me again in the fun and fascinating antique community here where online meets the real world. Please click the subscribe button below. Click the bell to be notified when new videos upload. Leave a comment below and hit thumbs up to like this video. Links to our online social media and our items for sale are in the description. This is George at the Antique Nomad. Bye for now.